I grew up beside a forest that everyone in our neighborhood pretended not to see. It wasn't marked on any map, yet had always been there, older than the houses and older than the road that ran through our small town. People walked past it every day, but never stepped inside. The adults said there were no trails, no clearings, no reason to wander in. They said it was just a mass of trees and undergrowth that led nowhere. They were wrong. There was a path, not a normal one. It never appeared when you were looking for it, only when your guard was down, when your thoughts drifted, when you felt alone even in a crowd. That was how I first saw it. I was a child then, and my backyard fence ran right up against the forest. One late afternoon, I saw a thin opening in the undergrowth. A clean path, dirt flat and smooth, leading straight into the trees. There was nothing strange at first, only the feeling that someone had made that path recently. Someone who didn't want others to know it was there. The trees were tall and crowded close together. Light barely reached the ground, even when the sun was high. As I walked deeper, everything felt muted and distant, like the world outside the forest was slipping away. The air had a heaviness to it, a kind of pressure that built slowly in my chest. The deeper I went, the more I felt watched. It didn't feel like one presence. It felt like many, low to the ground, standing still, counting my steps. The path had no branches, no turns, no break in direction. It went straight ahead in a line too perfect to be natural. I followed it for what felt like an hour, though time behaved strangely under those trees. When I finally turned around, the view behind me had changed. The entrance I walked through was gone, replaced by the same endless wall of trees. Only the path remained, stretching forward into darker shadows. That was when I noticed the footprints. They were small, bare, a child's size. They appeared beside my own impressions in the dirt, even though I had seen no one. The prints were fresh, so fresh that a few were still sinking into the soil like invisible feet had stepped there moments earlier. They trailed ahead of me, leading deeper into the forest. And worse, they also appear behind me. Close, very close, almost touching the backs of my shoes, as if something had been following silently in my wake. Panic finally snapped through me. I started walking faster, trying not to look left or right. The trees looked too smooth and too clean, like they had been stripped of branches, like something had taken them. When I finally broke into a run, the forest reacted. The air grew colder. The ground felt softer, like my feet were sinking more than they should. The path ahead seemed to stretch longer, as if the forest didn't want me to leave. Somehow, I eventually saw light ahead, a dull brightness between the trunks. I sprinted toward it until the pressure in my chest released, and I burst out of the tree line. I was still behind my house, my fence right there in front of me. But something was wrong. The forest looked darker than before, deeper, as if I had seen only the surface, and something underneath had shifted when I entered it. I ran inside and tried to forget what I saw. I convinced myself it had been my imagination, a gap in the brush that looked like a path. Footprints left long before I arrived, shadows that only felt like eyes. But that night, as I stood in the hallway near my back door, I felt something pull at my attention. A small pressure, like a thread tugging at the edge of my thoughts. I opened the door, even though I didn't plan to. My body moved before my mind caught up, and I saw it again. The path behind the fence. Perfect. Straight. Waiting. It had not been there an hour ago. It had followed me home. I told myself I wouldn't go back. I meant it. Yet the path behind the fence felt like a pressure in my skull. A constant tug, just heavy enough to keep my thoughts from settling. Every time I passed the back window, my eyes drifted toward the tree line. I didn't want to look. I didn't mean to. I just did. It was like the path was aware of me, patient, waiting for me to acknowledge it again. I avoided the yard for days, but the path didn't fade. It didn't grow over. The forest never reclaimed it. In fact, it seemed sharper than before, the edges cleaner, the dirt darker, as if freshly turned, as if something had walked it very recently. I didn't step onto it. I wouldn't. But one afternoon, I got close enough to see the ground clearly. That was when I noticed the footprints again. Not mine. Smaller. Bare. Human. And they weren't random. They were arranged in a neat line leading from the trees toward the fence, toward my house, stopping only a few feet from where I stood. The soil was soft and undisturbed except for those prints. No wind had erased them. No rain had blurred their edges. They looked carved into the earth with intent. I backed away as slowly as I could. Every instinct told me not to make sudden movements. It wasn't fear of an animal. It was the sense that something was watching my reaction very closely. Inside the house, I locked every door, though I wasn't sure locks mattered. That night, I slept poorly. I dreamed of the path stretching beside my bed, perfect and straight, leading somewhere I couldn't see. When I woke, the dream clung to me like humidity. My room smelled faintly of soil and pine, even though my window was closed. The next day, I found marks on the inside of the fence. Long lines in the wood. Not scratches. Not claw marks. They were too tall for an animal. Too smooth for a tool. They looked like something had dragged its fingers down the boards with slow pressure, testing the shape of the wood, testing the idea of a boundary. By the end of the week, I could feel something standing just behind the fence whenever I stepped outside. I never saw it, but the air grew still and heavy the moment I approached. My breath felt thin. My skin prickled like cold needles were brushing across it. I would retreat inside as quickly as possible, but the feeling didn't go away. It followed me through the rooms. I could feel it watching the walls, as though it were studying the layout of my home from the outside. Then the forest started changing. It should have been far away behind the fence. But certain nights, I would look out the back window, and the trees seemed closer. Only by a few inches, a foot at most, but the shift was undeniable. The trunks were too near the fence, the shadows between them too deep. The path looked shorter, almost pressed up against my yard. One morning I opened the curtains and felt my chest lock up. The forest had moved. The path began exactly where my fence ended. No grass, no space. Just dirt meeting would like the forest had grown forward in the night, as if the path wanted to erase every inch between itself and my back door. That was the moment I admitted it. The forest wasn't passive. It wasn't waiting for me to enter again. It was reaching for me. I tried to talk to my neighbor about it, but when we stood in my yard, the path was gone. Just trees and undergrowth. No sign anything had shifted. I felt insane. She gave me a concerned look and said the forest had looked the same for years. She didn't see the footprints, or the straight line of the path, or the strange smoothness of the trunks. But the moment she left the yard and I was alone, the path slid back into place. Clean, visible, perfect. That night something woke me, a feeling more than a sound. I sat up and felt the weight of a presence in the dark hallway. It was faint but unmistakable, a cold awareness hovering at the edge of perception. I walked slowly to the back of the house and felt the pressure intensify. My hand shook when I touched the curtain. I pulled it back. The path stopped right at my door. No space remained. No yard, no fence. Only dirt pressed against the back steps like the forest had swallowed everything in its way. There were footprints on the top step. Small, bare, perfectly dry despite the fact that nothing should have been able to walk there without disturbing the soil. My first thought was that the forest wanted me. My second was that something inside it had already reached me. I didn't know then that the path was only the beginning, that it wasn't bringing something toward my home. It was preparing me to walk it again. I told myself not to go outside. I tried to believe I could ignore it forever, but the path didn't allow ignorance. It pressed itself into my awareness with an insistence that felt alive. Every hour the urge grew stronger. Not curiosity, something closer to a demand. An instruction whispered without sound. I lasted one night. By morning the pressure in my head was unbearable. I had the sense that if I didn't look out the window, the forest would find another way in. When I finally pulled the curtain aside, my breath left me in a shaking wave. The forest had moved again. There was no fence, no yard, no boundary. My entire back view was nothing but the path and the trees rising directly behind it like a wall of dark green and shifting shadow. The soil pressed up against my house as if it had grown from the foundation itself. I knelt to touch the floor beneath the window and felt it trembling ever so slightly, like the earth was breathing under the boards. All morning I avoided the back rooms, moving through the house as though I were a trespasser in my own space. I kept my eyes down. I didn't want to catch even a glimpse of the tree line, but the weight of its presence made every room feel wrong. Corners felt deeper. Shadows leaned inward. Even the air tasted faintly of bark and something damp and ancient. By afternoon, I heard the soft shift of dirt outside. Not a noise, more like a sensation passing through the floorboards. A subtle pressure, a rearranging. I knew something was standing on the other side of the wall. I didn't need to open the window to feel it. I was shaking when I finally forced myself outside. The moment the door opened, the forest air washed over me, heavy and wet. The path was right there where my porch should have been. I stepped onto it before I could stop myself. Not deliberately. It felt more like my body had been nudged forward by a steady, unseen hand. The dirt was colder than I expected. The kind of cold that sits beneath the skin like a buried memory. The tree line loomed only a few steps away. The trunks, tall and dark, seemed arranged with unnatural precision, like pillars of an ancient building. Their bark was smooth in places, almost polished, as though brushed by many hands. Something moved deeper inside. Not an animal, not a person. More like the space between two trees thickened, darkened, and shifted its shape. A tall silhouette formed in the gloom. For a second, it resembled a human figure. Then it pulled itself back, dissolving into the shadows as though it had never been there at all. But it left something behind. The footprints. They trailed out from the darkness and stopped exactly at my feet. Small, bare, direct, a path within a path. I backed away and nearly fell trying to get inside the house. The moment the door shut behind me, the tremble in the floorboards stopped. The path seemed satisfied that I had come close enough. That night I dreamed again. Not the path, not the trees. A room, a small wooden room with no windows and a single door made of the same polished bark as the forest trees. The ground was dirt. The air was cold. I stood in the center of the room, but I wasn't alone. In the corner, something crouched, knees pulled to its chest. Its head was tilted. Its face was wrong. Not disfigured. Not monstrous. Wrong in a way my mind refused to fully register. as if seeing its features would break something fragile inside me. It breathed quietly, each rise of its chest slow and deliberate. When I woke, the entire house felt colder. I walked to the bathroom and wiped the mirror with my sleeve. My reflection looked paler than usual. Tired, but something else was off. My shirt sleeve had dirt on it. Fresh soil, dark soil, the exact color of the forest path. I hadn't gone back to it since the afternoon. I hadn't stepped in the dirt again. Yet the smell of pine and soil clung to me as if the forest had held me close during the night. I washed my hands. The dirt didn't rinse off at first. It smeared like ash before fading only after I scrubbed hard enough for my skin to redden. My pulse hammered in my ears. A sense of being observed pressed against the back of my neck like a cold breath. I checked the back window against every instinct telling me not to. The forest hadn't moved, but something else had. Halfway between my house and the first row of trees, standing neatly on the center of the path, was a small wooden door. No frame, no wall around it, just a door standing upright on its own, impossibly balanced. It wasn't there yesterday. It wasn't there this morning, but it was in my dream. It had followed me home, and the footprints around it were fresh. I stared at the wooden door standing in the middle of the forest path, unable to convince myself it was real. It had no hinges, no frame, no knob, just a smooth, dark surface made of the same polished bark that had appeared in my dream. The forest around it seemed to lean away slightly, as if even the trees refused to touch it. I waited for it to fade like a hallucination. But the longer I stood there, the more real it became, the more present. The air around it felt thicker, as if the atmosphere itself grew heavier in its presence. At first I thought the door was completely still, but then I noticed the slightest tremor in the soil at its base, like the ground was holding its breath. I walked outside slowly, not because I was brave, but because remaining inside felt worse. It felt like the house was becoming smaller with every moment I ignored the thing outside. The path pulled at me. My feet felt heavy but obedient, like they were already following an instruction. I had no choice but to obey. The closer I got, the more wrong the door felt. It wasn't rotting or weathered. It hadn't grown or changed, but it gave off a quiet sense of age that felt older than the forest itself. My hand shook as I reached toward it, even though I had no intention of touching it. I only meant to get close enough to understand if it was truly physical or some impossible projection from whatever was inside the woods. When my fingers were inches away, the surface pulsed. I froze. It wasn't a trick of the light. The wood itself breathed. A single slow inhale, barely noticeable but undeniable. I stepped back and nearly tripped. The soil behind me shifted as if something inside the ground was waiting for me to fall. I ran back inside and locked the door, even though I knew locks meant nothing now. I stayed away from the windows. Every room felt unsafe. Shadows pooled in corners that had never held shadows before. The house hummed faintly, as if resonating with a distant vibration. My bones felt the sound more than my ears. When night came, the fear deepened. The house creaked in slow, uneven pulses that matched the strange breathing rhythm of the forest door. I lay on the floor, unable to sleep. I kept imagining the bark surface rising and falling in long, silent breaths. I imagined something standing behind it waiting for me to open it, or worse, waiting for the moment it could open on its own. Sometime deep in the night, the knocking began. Not on my walls, not on my windows, but on the forest door. 3 slow taps, then silence, then 3 more like a ritual waiting to be accepted. The sound was faint, but carried through the air like it traveled a great distance in a straight line meant only for me. I covered my ears, but the knocking continued to vibrate through the floor. The house throbbed with each impact. My teeth ached. My breath shook. I wanted to scream. Instead, I curled up and waited for the sound to stop. It didn't. At some point, exhaustion forced my eyes closed. I don't remember falling asleep, but I remember what I saw once the dream took me. The forest was gone. Instead, I stood in that same dirt room from earlier. The walls bowed inward as if something outside pushed against them. The air was too cold to breathe normally. In the center of the room, the wooden door stood again, but this time it was open a crack. A single hand reached through the gap. Thin, long, the knuckles sharp beneath the skin as though carved. The fingers moved, slowly feeling the air the way a blind creature searches its surroundings. I wanted to back away, but my legs felt buried in the earth. The hand reached farther through the gap, and I saw the edge of a face behind it. Pale, watching, studying me. Its mouth opened slightly, as if attempting to sound. But no voice came. Only the pressure of attention, like a weight lowering over my chest. I snapped awake, gasping. The knocking had stopped. I stayed on the floor until morning, too afraid to move. When sunlight finally crept into the room, it felt weak, as though the forest had filtered most of it out. I forced myself to the window, expecting to see the door gone. It wasn't. It had moved closer to my house. The distance it had traveled during the night was careful and precise. Halfway down the path, standing upright, waiting. But the worst part wasn't that it had moved. The worst part was the footprints around it. They weren't small anymore. They were the size of my own feet. I stayed inside the house for hours, staring through the window at the forest path where the door now stood halfway to my home. The footprints around it matched my size too perfectly. Same length, same depth in the soil, same direction leading toward the door instead of away from it. But I had never stepped that close. I had never touched it. Whatever left those imprints was copying me or wearing something shaped like me. The house felt tighter with every passing moment. The corners had grown darker, as if shadows pooled unnaturally thick. Every footstep I made echoed a second time in some faint delayed way, like the house was repeating me. The silence had a pulse. The air felt heavy and watched. I told myself I would stay indoors until morning. But when night crept in, the decision no longer felt like mine. I kept sensing movement behind the walls. Soft, dragging motions, as though something slid upward from the foundation toward the roof. Once I thought I saw fingers press briefly against the wallpaper, stretching it inward before releasing. The light flickered even though the bulbs were steady. The wood beneath me vibrated softly, as if something large breathed under the floorboards. When the knocking began, I almost expected it. 3 slow taps against the exterior wall of the house. Not against the forest door this time, but the house itself. The taps grew heavier each time. Not fast, not aggressive, patient, constant. Something was announcing itself with a rhythm meant to wear down my resistance. I backed away from a wall and pressed myself into the hallway. The air thickened around me. The tapping moved along the wall, gliding in a line toward the front of the house. It reached the door, then stopped. I waited in a silence, so deep it felt physical. Minutes passed, maybe hours. I couldn't tell anymore. My heartbeat felt like the only sound in the world. Then the doorknob turned. Not fast, not violently. slowly with an unbroken motion that suggested no human hand at all. I had locked the deadbolt. I knew I had. But when the knob reached its end, the door creaked inward by an inch, as if the lock no longer existed. Cold air drifted inside. It smelled like damp soil and distant trees. I stepped back until my shoulders hit the far wall. Something leaned against the door from the outside, pushing just enough to widen the gap. There was nothing visible at first, only darkness curling into the entryway. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized it wasn't darkness. It was a shape, a tall, thin shape standing on the porch pressed against the doorframe. Its outline matched mine exactly. Same height, same stance, same tilt of the head, but the movements were wrong. Too smooth, too slow, like a puppet being guided by a distant hand. It stepped inside without lifting its feet. It glided forward as though the air carried it. I couldn't breathe. My legs buckled, but I remained upright by some reflex of terror. The figure moved until it stood directly in front of me, only a few feet away. Then it paused. Its head bent sideways in a strange, thoughtful motion, as if studying its own reflection. But I wasn't its reflection. I was its destination. The hallway lights flickered once. When I steadied, the figure was closer. It hadn't stepped. It had simply appeared nearer. The space between us dissolved until its forehead nearly pressed against mine. Its empty face had no eyes, no mouth, only the faint impressions of features that were trying to grow into place. It raised one hand. Its fingers were long shadows stretching toward my chest as though reaching to slip inside me. The walls trembled. The floor creaked. Something old and heavy breathed through the house, and I realized it wasn't inside the figure. It was the forest. The entire wooded path had extended itself into my home. The branches outside swayed violently despite the still air. Leaves scratched the windows in sharp, frantic bursts. The path glowed faintly through the doorway, as if lit from beneath. I saw the wooden door standing at the far end of the trees, but it wasn't stationary now. It moved slowly along the path, sliding forward with the weight of something enormous behind it. The figure pressed its hand against my chest, and the hallway disappeared. I was in the dirt room again. The soil walls curved inward as though squeezing me. The wooden door stood directly in front of me now, no longer in the forest. Here, with me. It pulsed with the rhythm of a living thing. The air evaporated from my lungs, and I dropped to my knees. The figure stood beside the door, perfectly still, waiting for something. The door cracked open by a hair. Cold air leaked out. A presence beyond the gap pressed against the opening like a vast, unseen shape testing the boundary. The soil shook violently. The figure bent down beside me, its featureless face tilting. It raised one of its hands and pointed at me with slow certainty. Not a threat, not a gesture of violence. A summons. The door opened wider. A breath colder than winter slid across my skin. Something enormous leaned forward, ready to step through. Shadows pooled around me, rising until they covered everything. My mind dissolved into static. I felt myself being pulled toward the open door, not physically, but from inside my chest, like my thoughts were being harvested. Then silence. I woke up on the forest path at the edge of my property. Morning light filtered through the trees. My house stood quiet, normal, but the soil around me was disturbed, dragged, as if something had pulled me here and left me behind in a hurry. The path behind me was empty. The wooden door was gone. At first I thought it was over, that something had returned me. But when I looked down at my feet, the ground told the truth. There were footprints beside mine. Same size, same shape, but those prints led not back into the forest. They led straight to my doorstep, and my front door was open.